The small cardboard box left at the sanctuary gates should have contained just another abandoned kitten. But when 3-month-old Scout escaped his secure room and somehow found his way into the habitat of Ghost, a traumatized snow leopard who had not responded to another living creature in 2 years, something impossible happened. The massive predator, whose mother had been killed by poachers and who had spent 24 months staring blankly at distant mountains, did something that made every wildlife expert question everything they knew about animal behavior. Ghost lowered his enormous head to the tiny white kitten between his paws and made a sound he had never made since his rescue, a gentle chuff, the vocalization snow leopard mothers use to comfort their cubs. If you love stories about the incredible bonds that form between animals against all odds, please subscribe to Wild Heart Stories. Your subscription helps us share more emotional tales about animal connections and strengthens our community dedicated to celebrating the extraordinary relationships of the animal kingdom. Ghost had arrived at Mountain Haven Wildlife Sanctuary in Montana 2 years earlier at just 8 months old. International police had intercepted wildlife traffickers attempting to sell him to a Russian collector. His mother lay dead in a Himalayan cave, killed by the same poachers who had stolen her cub. The trauma left Ghost emotionally unreachable. He ate when fed, tolerated veterinary care, but never truly engaged with anything. Dr. Rebecca Chen, the sanctuary director, had tried everything over those 2 years. Enrichment toys, behavioral specialists, even attempts to house Ghost with other rescued felines. Nothing worked. Ghost would lie on his observation rock for hours, staring at the mountains with pale green eyes that held no light, no curiosity, no connection to the present moment. Gavin Martinez, the head keeper, had spent countless hours trying to reach the beautiful snow leopard. Ghost's thick silver-gray coat marked with black rosettes was pristine, his physical health excellent. But behind those glacial eyes was an emptiness that no medical examination could diagnose. It was as if Ghost's spirit had died with his mother, leaving only a magnificent shell going through the motions of survival. On that October morning, when Jennifer Harrison found the cardboard box at the sanctuary entrance, she had no idea she was about to discover the key to unlocking Ghost's frozen heart. Inside was a completely white kitten with bright blue eyes who showed no fear, only curiosity. Unlike most abandoned animals who arrive terrified and sick, this kitten seemed healthy and remarkably confident. Kevin suggested the name Scout, which perfectly captured the bold, inquisitive nature. Scout was placed in the quarantine facility, a building with glass-walled rooms designed for new arrivals. Dr. Lisa Matthews examined him and found excellent health. The plan was simple: complete the 30-day quarantine, then transfer Scout to an appropriate adoption organization. But Scout had other plans. The quarantine rooms had been designed to contain a wide variety of species, yet somehow Scout found a tiny gap in a ventilation grate and squeezed through. A facility-wide search began immediately. Staff checked every building, every hiding spot, calling for the small white kitten as afternoon turned to evening and temperatures dropped. Just as darkness was falling, Thomas Wilson radioed from the large carnivore section. His voice carried disbelief. There was a small white animal inside Ghost's habitat. Kevin grabbed emergency equipment and sprinted toward Ghost's enclosure, his mind racing through terrible scenarios. If Scout had gotten in with the snow leopard, they were likely too late. But when Kevin reached the observation area and looked into the habitat, what he saw made him question his own eyes.
Ghost was lying on his usual rock in his typical position, staring at the mountains, and curled between the snow leopard's enormous front paws, sleeping peacefully, was Scout. The tiny white kitten looked impossibly small against Ghost's bulk, yet utterly safe. Kevin's instinct was to call for immediate intervention, to tranquilize Ghost and rescue the kitten, but something made him pause. Ghost showed none of the body language of a predator viewing prey. No tension, no focused staring, no preparation to strike. Most remarkably, Ghost's eyes, which normally remained fixed on distant mountains regardless of what happened around him, kept flicking down toward Scout, then back to the mountains, then down again. Dr. Chen arrived within minutes and observed through binoculars. After 20 minutes, she noted crucial facts. Ghost's pupils were not dilated for hunting. His muscles showed no tension. His breathing remained slow and steady. Scout was in deep, genuine sleep, the kind that only happens when an animal feels entirely safe. As the temperature dropped toward freezing, a decision had to be made. They could not leave Scout in the enclosure overnight, but retrieving him without traumatizing both animals would be complex. Kevin tried using aromatic kitten food to lure Scout toward the observation area. After several minutes, Scout began to stir, stretched, and took one step toward the offered food. Then he paused and looked back at Ghost. The snow leopard had also shifted position slightly, watching the kitten's movements. Then Ghost did something none of the staff had ever witnessed. He vocalized. Not a roar or growl, but a soft chuff, the non-threatening sound big cats use to communicate peaceful intentions, particularly between mothers and cubs. Scout responded by turning completely away from Kevin and the food. The kitten walked back to Ghost, settled between the snow leopard's front legs, and began purring, loud enough to be audible from a distance. Dr. Chen called an emergency staff meeting right there at the observation area. After intense debate, she made an unprecedented decision. They would monitor through the night using security cameras, with staff ready to intervene immediately if Ghost showed any threatening behavior. For now, they would allow this impossible partnership to continue. Throughout the night, staff rotated observation duty. Hour after hour, the scene remained unchanged. Ghost stayed on his rock, body curved protectively around Scout. Around midnight, when temperatures dropped to near freezing, Ghost stood up carefully. Scout woke and looked confused. Ghost made another soft chuff, then began walking slowly toward the heated indoor den. After a moment, Scout followed. Ghost had refused to use this heated cave for 2 years except during severe storms, but on this night he walked deliberately inside and positioned himself on a platform. Scout scrambled up beside him, and within minutes both were sleeping, Ghost's long tail curled around Scout like a blanket. Morning came with Dr. Chen reviewing all overnight footage. Hours of peaceful coexistence, with Ghost demonstrating patience and gentle care that seemed impossible for an animal who had been emotionally unreachable for years. Ghost was not merely tolerating Scout, he was actively protecting and comforting the small cat. The obvious answer was separation for safety reasons, but Ghost had taken his first steps out of emotional isolation because of Scout's presence. Removing the kitten might send the snow leopard back into the unreachable state he had occupied for 2 years. After 3 hours of emergency board discussion, a compromise was reached. Scout would be separated from Ghost using a clear acrylic barrier that would allow them to see and smell each other while preventing physical contact. The temporary panel was installed that afternoon. When the carrier opened, Scout immediately tried to climb back toward Ghost. The moment Scout realized he could not reach Ghost directly, the kitten began vocalizing. Ghost responded with chuffs and soft calls, approaching the barrier and pressing his nose against it while Scout did the same from his side.
For the next 48 hours, both animals remained fixated on the barrier. Ghost abandoned his observation rock entirely, spending all his time pressed against the acrylic panel. Scout mirrored this from his side. Neither showed interest in food or anything else. They simply waited. On the third day, Dr. Chen made her decision. She had consulted with specialists, reviewed countless hours of footage, considered every risk. Sometimes the most responsible choice was also the most unconventional one. Ghost and Scout were going to be allowed to remain together with modifications to make their unique situation as safe as possible while honoring the bond that had formed between them. The acrylic barrier was removed that afternoon. Both animals reunited with an intensity of relief that was palpable. Scout climbed onto Ghost's face, rubbing against the snow leopard's chin while purring. Ghost responded with gentle chuffs and began grooming Scout with his enormous tongue, an action performed with such careful gentleness that the kitten clearly enjoyed it. The impossible family had been made official. Over the following weeks and months, Ghost's transformation became increasingly profound. For the first time since arrival, the snow leopard began displaying natural behaviors that had been absent. He started scent marking various points in his habitat, began using vertical space, and investigated enrichment items ignored for months. Most significantly, Ghost began responding to his name when Kevin called. These were small changes, but for Ghost, they represented monumental progress from the unreachable state he had occupied for 2 years. Scout treated the massive snow leopard like a combination of jungle gym, security blanket, and playmate. The kitten would climb on Ghost's head, attack his tail, sleep sprawled across his back, and generally behave as if the 100-pound weight difference was irrelevant. Ghost's responses amazed the staff. When Scout pounced on Ghost's tail with tiny teeth, Ghost would move it slowly and deliberately, never with quick motions that might send the kitten flying. When Scout accidentally poked Ghost's eye or ear while climbing, Ghost would carefully shift position rather than shaking him off forcefully. The breakthrough came during the 3rd week when Scout was engaged in his usual tail hunting. Ghost, who had previously simply allowed Scout to attack without responding, suddenly moved his tail in a sweeping motion that caused Scout to tumble, then gently pinned the kitten with one enormous paw. Scout responded with intense excitement, and after a moment, Ghost released him. Scout immediately crouched in a play bow, inviting more interaction. Ghost responded by lowering his front end in a similar posture. Staff members who witnessed this were moved to tears. Ghost was playing. The traumatized snow leopard who had been emotionally unreachable was engaging in joyful, voluntary play behavior. One fearless kitten had accomplished what 2 years of professional intervention could not. As autumn deepened into early winter, new challenges emerged. Ghost's thick double coat made him perfectly adapted to cold temperatures, but Scout was a domestic shorthair, vulnerable to cold stress. The first truly cold night arrived in mid-November, temperatures dropping to 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Ghost remained outside until nearly midnight with Scout pressed against his belly for warmth. But as temperature continued dropping, something remarkable happened. Ghost stood up carefully, ensuring Scout was awake and alert, then began walking slowly toward the heated den entrance. He paused every few steps and looked back,
clearly checking that Scout was following. Inside, Ghost selected a raised platform and settled onto it. Scout immediately burrowed into the thick fur of Ghost's belly. This pattern repeated over subsequent cold nights. Ghost seemed to have an internal gauge that told him when conditions had become too harsh for Scout. The snow leopard had become a responsive caregiver, making real-time decisions about his charge's well-being.
As months passed, Ghost and Scout's bond deepened, and their story spread worldwide. A documentary captured their relationship, sparking conversations throughout the zoo and sanctuary community about animal welfare practices and the importance of social bonds for psychological health. Dr. Chen reflected on how easy it would have been to separate them after Scout's initial escape, to play it safe and avoid criticism or risk. She was grateful that she and her team had been willing to take a chance, to trust that these two animals might know better than humans what they needed to thrive. Ghost had lost his mother to violence and spent years trapped in grief. Scout had been abandoned by humans who should have cared for him. Both had experienced the trauma of rejection and loss, and both had somehow found in each other exactly what they needed to heal. Ghost had taught Scout about patience, quiet strength, and being present. The snow leopard provided protection and guidance. Scout had taught Ghost about joy, about living rather than existing, about opening his heart despite the risk of future pain. The kitten provided companionship and purpose, giving Ghost a reason to engage with life. On a warm spring morning, Ghost and Scout were in their usual positions on the observation rock. Ghost was looking at mountains, pale green eyes, distant but not empty as they once had been. Scout was beside him, grooming his white fur. After several minutes of peaceful stillness, Scout finished grooming and moved closer to Ghost. The young cat pressed his head against the snow leopard's front leg, purring softly. Ghost lowered his own head and gently nuzzled Scout's ear. To anyone who knew their story, who understood what each had survived and how they found each other, the scene represented something profound. Their relationship served as a reminder that connection could transcend differences that seemed insurmountable, that healing was possible even after profound trauma, that family was defined not by blood or species, but by the choice to care for another being. Ghost was no longer haunted by the past. Scout was no longer alone. They were simply together, which was everything either of them needed to be.